We'll continue to explore what's come out of the United Nations today, and to talk to us a little bit more about that, we're now joined by Wits University International Relations expert, Professor John Stremlau. Prof, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Peter. Good evening.
I hate to say, this thing was hyped up for Biden, that he had to deliver perhaps one of his most important speeches of his time because it was a new era and it was the first time on this huge stage. But that being said, do you think he lived up to the moment?
Oh, I think he lived up to the moment, Peter, and I think that the audience at the UN was glad to hear Joe Biden rather than another speech of isolation and unilateralism by Donald Trump. All things are relative, Peter, and this was no speech that Trump would ever deliver. It was a speech that was very well framed and covered all of the terrain from Africa to Latin America to the particular problems of South Asia and China. But it also dealt primarily in the outset with the COVID crisis, which is of such global concern, and the climate change crisis. And the fact that Biden emphasized diplomacy over military for my ears, of course, was very welcome. The skepticism should not be for Biden's intentions, Peter. The skepticism should be his capacity to deliver politically. We know that Cyril Ramaphosa wants to have a better world in South Africa, but his hands are very tightly tied by the factionalism within his party. And Joe Biden faces a far worse polarization in the U.S. Congress. The Democrats have a very thin majority. He's got very high ambitions and aspirations for his presidency. But the question is, can he deliver? And that we don't really know tonight. And so while I welcome the rhetoric of the UN, I want to see whether he can deliver on a few of the promises that he made tonight.
And what we know from his experience is that this is a man who understands international relations and perhaps is friends even with many of the people who might be leading their countries at this time. How will that help him with this multilateralism message that he's been that he was propagating today?
Well, in a number of ways, Peter. It is good for you to remind your viewers that foreign relations does have a very real personal component. Joe Biden maintains that he knows Xi Jinping very well. They talked together for 24, 25 hours when they were both vice presidents. He's had a 2-hour conversation with him just after becoming president, and he's had another 90-minute conversation a couple of weeks ago with Xi Jinping. They're very different. They have different interests. And he tried to reassure the world that there would be no new Cold War. I know there's some nervousness about that. But these kind of relations are very important. I've always said that Cyril Ramaphosa, Peter, has an inside track to Joe Biden, because Joe Biden is an Irish American who took a very real personal interest in the Good Friday Agreement and the peace settlement in between Northern Ireland and the mainland of Ireland. And Cyril Ramaphosa was vital to that solution, vital to it. And Joe would know that, and he would appreciate Cyril Ramaphosa and listen to him, if for no other reason, out of respect for what he accomplished in the peace settlement in Ireland. So, we talk about interests, we talk about grand geostrategy, but it often does come down to very human dimensions, and I think it's good for you to mention that from time to time. We just think back to what Mandela was able to achieve in this country, and that was done through a careful management of human relations. So let's see where we are. But as I say, Joe Biden has got a very, very difficult domestic political circumstance on his watch, and that's going to involve what the authority of the U.S. is. When Xi Jinping talks to the UN by virtual video at the end of today, everyone knows that he speaks with great authority, Peter, because he runs the government and he's in total control. In democracies, that's not the case.
All right, we'll talk about US-China relations. The Secretary General had warned about this Cold War between the two of them and had hoped that they would find a place before this sitting. But he did talk about, as you said, about the hotspots around the world. And as you said, he's got domestic international policy issues, and Afghanistan is one of them. Let's listen to what he had to say about some of those issues.
More than 100 nations united again around a shared statement, and the Security Council adopted a resolution outlining how we'll support the people of Afghanistan moving forward, laying out the expectations to which we'll hold the Taliban when it comes to respecting universal human rights. We all must advocate for women, the rights of women and girls to use their full talents, to contribute economically, politically, and socially, and pursue their dreams free of violence and intimidation. From Central America to the Middle East to Africa to Afghanistan, wherever it appears in the world. We all must call out and condemn the targeting and oppression of racial, ethnic, and religious minorities when it occurs whether it occurs in Xinjiang or northern Ethiopia or anywhere in the world.
He said quite a lot in a few words there. Let's start with Afghanistan, because it was a big issue for him, both at home and internationally. Do you think that he positioned it well in his message today, talking about the first time America is not at war anywhere?
Well, he can certainly claim that, and it's true. And I think people wanted to end this endless war. Nation-building projects have been a dismal failure for the United States. And put your efforts into diplomacy. He said he's gone from never-ending war to never-ending diplomacy. That's not a bad line, Peter. But again, it's early innings, and the way that the United States pulled out of Afghanistan was shambolic and an embarrassment to everyone. And I just hope that the Taliban is a different Taliban now in 2021 than it was in 2001 when it was overthrown by the Americans, who then should have dealt with the Taliban, but they did not have any time for trying to figure out what was driving the Taliban then. And now maybe there will be some relations between the Taliban and the United States.
We saw an image of Afghanistan representative there. People have been wondering who might actually take a position for the country. If we do hear from Afghanistan, what likely message do you think we'll hear from them?
I think it's going to sound, at least internationally, very pragmatic. You know, Biden mentioned Xinjiang. That's where the Uyghurs, the Muslim minority that is being oppressed by the Chinese majority. And that's right on the border with Afghanistan. And yet the Afghan Taliban regime talks very positively about doing business with China and promoting economic trade and cooperation. So let's just wait and see. There are mixed signals being sent. But there's no question that if the Taliban is a fundamentalist Islamic regime, how can it tolerate Chinese suppression of the Uyghurs, the Muslim minority, 13 million of them, just over the border in Xinjiang province?
Where do you think we are in terms of US-China relations? As I said, the Secretary General was very, very concerned about a Cold War developing between these two nations. It started, of course, with escalations with Donald Trump, but Joe Biden also has to be seen to be standing firm, but at the same time trying to soften and lower the temperature.
Well, it's very tricky, and you know that he's seen one other leader in New York before he rushes back to Washington to get ready for tomorrow's COVID meeting with UN, his UN-sponsored, of which he's the chairman. But he did find time to see Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, and he has just done this enormous surprise deal with the Australians for nuclear subs that the U.S. will provide, The French are very angry at what they feel is a betrayal, because they were going to provide conventional subs, diesel subs, and yet this is to send a message to China. I think it's not a bad decision, actually, because I think the Chinese and Xi Jinping are very expansionary, and the last thing we want to have is a confrontation over Taiwan. That's the big prize in all this. The Chinese want to take back control of all Chinese-speaking territories like Hong Kong and Taiwan, and the U.S. is drawing a line here, and the nuclear deal is sending a signal. That may not be so bad if indeed they can cooperate in places like Africa or on climate change. Then you'll have a competitive relationship, and maybe you'll punt some of these problems, which have been, in the case of Taiwan, punted for decades.
I'm not sure if I'm interpreting this correctly, but it sounded as if there was a veiled threat when he talked about protocols on cyber security and that new protocols needed to be agreed to, but at the same time saying that we are not afraid to fight back in the appropriate way. Was that pointed at Russia, maybe?
Well, it was pointed at all sources of technology, which is an abuse of power, or ransomware, which is just extortion, which does tend to emanate more from Russia than any other country right now. It is a reminder to me that the Cold War with the Soviet Union is over. The Soviet Union is no more. And what you have is a much more difficult challenge in managing the U.S.-China competition, which Gutierrez actually was very frank about, both in his earlier comments and then in his a speech to the General Assembly. So it puts a marker down that the international community is watching. And if the U.S. really wants to get along in multilateral forums, it ought to find a way to manage this competition. And that is the number one challenge that faces American foreign policy. But I can't speak for Xi Jinping in China. You know, that's a closed shop. A Soviet used to joke with me that the Soviet Union was full of secrets but no mystery. The United States had no secrets but was a total mystery in terms of its politics. And Xi Jinping does have a problem figuring out what the Americans are going to do next.
All right, perhaps finally and briefly, if you can, UNGA 76, for it to look as if it's been successful, what do you think needs to happen?
I'm sorry, for which, Peter?
I was just saying for UNGA 76 to...
Oh, UNGA 76, thank you.
Yes, sorry.
Jargon, I don't know. I think, Peter, we're going to have to confront COVID and climate. And those are the existential threats facing humanity. And the UN knows that. Let's see what happens in Glasgow in November.
Professor John Stremlau, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much. Your insights, greatly appreciated. Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right, that's Professor John Stremlau from Wits University, international relations expert, speaking to us about the UN General Assembly, number 76, which is now in session.